The following program is presented by the Theosophical Society in America.
In Part 1 of Foundations of the Ageless Wisdom, we started with the first fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine. It was spoken of mainly as space, as eternal, immutable, boundless space, upon which all speculation is impossible, and was likened to the pre-Big Bang theory of modern physics. We went on to suggest that this eternal void polarizes, which gives rise to a triplicity of spirit, the subjective side of the universe, the root or possibility of matter, the objective side of the universe, and abstract motion, the tension that exists between the first two. These three aspects are said to be the bases of all existence, and are present everywhere in the manifested universe. We are rooted in these three. They are the very essence of our being.
Now, to move a little further on, it is said that that triplicity further becomes a septenary. That is, the three becomes seven. Now, it isn't as though they become something else. It's as though that three expresses itself, in a sense, as seven major modes of being, if I can phrase it in that way. Seven planes of nature is what it's called in the literature. Now, just as that primary three is one, indivisible, whole, this septenary division is also really, ultimately indivisible. It's a septenary manifestation, but it's still unified. And it expresses itself in human beings as what we call the seven principles of the human being. And we'll discuss those more thoroughly as the course goes along. Now, in this class, we're going to look a little more closely at that third term of the primary three, motion. For some reason, to the human mind, that's in many ways much more fascinating to deal with, and I think you'll find some of it fun to think about. Before we do that, however, I think it would be nice to hear from HPB again in her own words as she summarizes the second fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine.
Madame Blavatsky writes, quote, "The second assertion is the absolute universality of that law of periodicity, of flux and reflux, ebb and flow, which physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature. An alternation such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking, is a fact so common, so perfectly universal and without exception, that it is easy to comprehend that in it we see one of the absolutely fundamental laws of the universe." Unquote.
Now, in the first fundamental proposition, space was primary, wasn't it? In the second, motion is actually primary. You didn't hear the word motion mentioned. You really hear more the idea of periodicity, of cyclicity, of the ebb and flow, the pulsation of the universe in the outward and inward movement. But you see, we can't have pulsation, we can't have periods, we can't have cycles if we don't have motion, can we? So motion is really more primary, and this idea of cyclicity is a way of describing that motion, how that motion reveals itself. Now, motion is referred to in quite a number of ways in the secret doctrine, and I'm only going to mention a few. It's sometimes talked about as divine mind. We might also think of it as life, and she certainly refers to it as the creative power of the universe. Now, I'd like to take just a minute or two to talk about divine mind, because I think there's an awful lot of simplistic thought out about divine mind. We tend to think, some of us, I think, that the divine mind is a thinking, feeling mind like our own, and that somehow the divine mind decided one day, well, I think I'd like to make an ape. And after making the ape, felt a little disappointed and said, well, I think I'd like to make a human being. And after doing that and having us around for a while, thought, well, I think I'll wipe them all out with a flood. Well, I don't think the divine mind is that way at all. When we talk about divine mind, we're really talking about fundamental principles in nature. So that if you, for example, should look in the corner of any room, you will see that 3 lines come together at the corner, each one at right angles to the other 2. Now, at the risk of heresy, Jesus, Gautama Buddha, or H.P. Blavatsky could not put a 4th line through that central point and have that 4th line be at right angles to the other 3. We couldn't do that. We can say that's an idea in the mind of God or in divine mind. It's an inviolate principle. It's the way things are in this 3-dimensional world. That's the nature of divine mind. It's the principles themselves. Now further, she says about this motion or divine mind, that it's the creative power of the universe. And that's very interesting, really, because very often in mythologies we find that the creative power is a secondary deity. In the Christian system, for example, it's not God the Father who actually is the creator, but God the Son, you see, who issues from the Father, who is not a creation according to the Christian theology, but it is He in John's Gospel who creates all that is. Without Him was not made anything that was made, I believe the words are. And that is an issue, in a sense, from the Father, and yet still one with the Father, as motion is one with the other 2 principles in the theosophical idea. Now, we must have it clear about creation. We tend to think of a creator and a created. This is not the case in the theosophical philosophy. And the Master K.H. in writing to Sinnett made this very, very clear. Sinnett was an Anglican Christian. He was living, of course, in the last century, not familiar with these ideas, and it was very difficult for him to understand the whole theosophical concept of creation. And the Master K.H. said to him finally, go on and think that man and nature were created, and you'll be running up against hard facts forever. But once realize that human beings and nature were no more created than this iceberg now before me, and the whole thing will become clear. Both human beings and nature are states for a given time, depending on their state of development, their level of development. So you see, the iceberg wasn't created by someone. It's a state within the sea. And if we get that idea clear, I think this idea of the unity and the diversity will become clearer as well. The diversity is in the states of this ultimate one, as it changes, as it grows, as it evolves. But what is that iceberg? It's part of the sea. It's the sea itself, isn't it?
We can see motion as the creative power of the universe in the common everyday activities of our lives. Take the chemical composition H2O, for example. We use it differently and call it different things, water, steam, or ice, depending on its rate of motion. At colder temperatures, its molecular movement is slow, while at hotter temperatures it moves much faster. And yet all 3 are ultimately the same thing, part of one unity, when viewed from a broader perspective. Here, motion can be seen as a creative power producing seemingly different things. Just the rate of motion makes the difference between water, steam, or ice.
Now, if motion as divine mind is really the creative power of the universe, then don't you think it would seem to follow that all motion at every level, inwardly and outwardly, at every level, everywhere, would in some way reveal this quality of the divine mind, that is, the qualities of purposefulness, orderliness, meaning in its very broadest sense, if we can think of motion as divine mind, or the principles in action in a sense. Let's see if there may be some truth to it. I'd like to just go over with you a few of the kingdoms of nature, the crystal, the plant, the animal, and the human, and just see if we find some evidence that might support this idea. We'll start with the most difficult, crystals. They don't seem to move at all, do they? Well, they don't in one sense, but in another they do, because their molecular structure is in constant motion, isn't it? And the pattern of motion of a quartz crystal is different from the pattern of motion of a crystal of table salt. That's how we know the difference between the two, in a sense. It grows, in a sense, doesn't it? It accretes, it grows larger. It fulfills its own destiny, but it always maintains its own intrinsic order. It's always going to be a quartz crystal, and it's always going to have its own internal order of motion. But then we come to the plant kingdom. Now we can visibly see movement. And we see that plants at least move in two major ways. They put their roots down to get water. They also put their roots down to stabilize the plant so that it doesn't get blown over in the wind. It seems to be purposeful, that movement down into the earth, doesn't it? And then the plant moves in the other direction. It moves up to get the light of the sun, to get food from the sun. Now, if we come to the animal kingdom, there is a tremendous variety of motion, isn't there? All kinds of movements of all kinds of creatures. And now they're much more free, aren't they? The rocks couldn't do much. The plants a little bit more. The animals have a great deal more freedom. And we can see different types of meaning in the motion, and sometimes we don't know what the motion is all about. I think the species know, but we don't. Now we come to the human kingdom, and the mind reels at the possibilities. Let's take something like body language. If we're talking to a friend, and as we're talking to the friend, we're having a nice conversation, very pleasant, and then we bring up a particular subject, and our friend folds the arms across the front, a motion. That usually means you've hit a bump, and you'd probably better back off at that minute until you can straighten it out and the arms relax. Not necessarily every folded arm means that, but that can mean that. If you see someone walking across the lawn or across the sidewalk, see them outside, walking along, and you've never seen them before even, if they're walking very, very slowly and they're drooping their head down, you would probably think, and you would probably be right, that either they're in a meditative mood, or they're very sad, or something of the kind. You would certainly not assume that they were jubilantly happy, would you? Because the way they walk reveals something about the way they feel.
When I was younger, she'd come to me in dreams.
Music is another obvious example of motion. Indeed, our whole experience of music is motion-based. Every sound we hear is a vibratory quality, for it is through vibration of the air that musical sounds are carried to and heard through the mechanisms of the inner ear. Different musical instruments produce different vibrations. If we add other vibratory factors, such as tempo, rhythm, harmony, and melody, we begin to see the many ways in which music as motion is a powerful force in our lives.
And no one could ever tell me, and I don't think anyone could ever tell you, that there isn't a vast difference in meaning between acid rock and Mozart. There's a tremendous difference of meaning. No matter which we like or whether we like both, no moral judgments, it means something different, doesn't it? Now, our whole nature really is in one sense a vibratory state at all the different levels. And motion all through inwardly as well as outwardly, has meaning. All conscious motion, I think, has meaning. Even if I reach up to scratch my head, I've done it for a purpose, haven't I? We talk with our hands to emphasize something. We have the body motion, as I said. But also there's unconscious motion inwardly. The heart is beating for its purpose, carrying out its job. The liver, the kidneys, the blood, all moving in their own way for their own purposes for the sake of the body as a whole. Now let's look at our emotions. We've fairly well established, I hope, that motion may indeed have purpose and meaning and order in the different kingdoms of nature. But what about inwardly? Because motion is there also, we suggest. Certainly the Theosophical philosophy insists upon it. Let's just take two emotions with which we are all unfortunately familiar, and then some more pleasant ones. Anxiety and depression. We've all experienced those two at least a little bit in our lives, I hope not much. If we had to say that anxiety was either fast or slow, I think most of you would say it feels fast. And if we had to say that depression was either fast or slow, I think most of you would say it feels slow. Now let's take two other emotions. Let's take enthusiasm and serenity. And again, if I ask, how does serenity feel? You would most likely respond, slow. And how does enthusiasm feel? You would most likely respond, fast. So we can think of our emotional states in terms of motion as well. But note well, anxiety and enthusiasm are both fast, but we'd sure rather have enthusiasm than anxiety. Depression and serenity are both slow, but we'd rather have serenity than depression. So there's something else at work here, perhaps rhythm, perhaps all kinds of things. But it is nonetheless fascinating to see that inwardly, subjectively, we can see our emotions in terms of motion. Now the mind also can be thought of in terms of motion. We use expressions in our language like, that individual is very slow to change their mind. That's when we're being kind. They may be stubborn. We say someone has a very quick mind. Terms that are referred to really from motion, aren't they? Quick, fast, movement. We say an idea flashes on our mind. Again, implicit in that is the idea of motion. We talk about the tidal wave of human thought. Again, phrases that suggest motion in the mind. Now, in coming to a close for this session, I'd like to go back for a moment to that first fundamental proposition, which must never really be forgotten. That idea of the intrinsic unity of all, that everything really is differentiated states of one indivisible reality. If that is so, then surely everything must affect everything else. Isn't that reasonable? Because all is one fabric in a sense. Therefore, a tug at one part of the fabric will affect some other part of the fabric. We can see this at least in our own personal nature. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence out in the scientific world that that's true now. But let's just stick to our own personal experience. Let's take first a negative example and then a positive. If I am worried about something, that's a mental state, isn't it? It's an idea that bothers me, a concept. Something bothers me, a thought about something, a fear. That idea, projecting into the future, afraid of something that's going to happen, which I have conceptualized, will affect my feelings, won't it? It'll make me very anxious. And if I continue to do that in a pattern over and over again, not if I just do it for a few minutes or a day or two or a week maybe, but if I do that month after month, year after year, I can almost guarantee an ulcer or a heart attack or something of the kind will occur. The mind affects the feelings affect the body. And it can do it in a positive or a negative way, because a joyful person does it the other way around. Now let's take the happy one. Let's say we're sitting along, not too energetic, we are a little bored maybe with life at the minute, and we start to think about some project that we've been dealing with, and we suddenly get a creative idea. Wow, that's fascinating. Right away, our emotions are joyful, and we've got energy. We get up and feel like we want to do something. So an idea in our mind can affect us in both ways. Now I think I'd like to have us think for a minute again about this idea of the internal patterns of energy. Whether we're depressed, anxious, joyful, our inner state really can be thought of in terms of motion. And I think it helps a great deal if we do think of it that way. If when we feel in a way that we would rather not like to feel, if we remember that no one got in there with a mixmaster and did it for us. We did it all by ourselves. Now, do you see that there's great hope in this? Because if I have done it all by myself, I can also undo it all by myself. So we can now refer back to that idea in the secret doctrine that the universe and all therein is formed by accelerated motion set into activity by the ever-to-be unknown power. And what is that ever-to-be unknown power? It's that first fundamental proposition, that unspeakable reality in which you and I are also rooted. If that's true, you see, we have the possibility, I don't say it's easy, we have the possibility of retreating into that background state that we are, and from there recreating the foreground within us, using that creative power of motion to actually change our lives.